Tu sais, Michel, j'ai jamais pris le temps de te le dire, mais elle est vraiment stylée, ta taverne, hein. Un décor pareil, là, tu sais ce que ça m'inspire comme soirée?
Ouais, je sais, moi aussi. Mais le problème, c'est que j'ai développé une allergie au latex.
Alors, moi, je pensais à des soirées jeux de rôle, Michel.
Oui, moi aussi.
Comme vous le savez certainement, si vous n'êtes pas tombé sur cette soirée spéciale par hasard, nous fêtons cette année 2016 un double anniversaire. Les 90 ans de la création de Cthulhu par H.P. Lovecraft et le 35e anniversaire de la première édition du jeu de rôle inspiré de son univers, l'appel de Cthulhu. Alors évidemment, nos connaissances en nécromancie ne nous permettent pas d'interroger Lovecraft lui-même pour savoir comment il a eu l'idée de créer ce dieu maléfique.
Alors si ça peut aider, une fois j'ai fait une soirée spiritisme et on est entré en contact avec mon grand-père. C'était trop flippant.
Alors, déjà, non, ça n'aide pas, et ensuite, Michel, il faut pas faire de spiritisme si t'es pas prêt à rentrer en contact avec des esprits.
Bah justement, c'était ça qui était flippant. Parce qu'il est pas mort, mon grand-père.
Bref, Sandy Petersen, en revanche, est beaucoup plus accessible. Bon, il habite au Texas, mais il a eu la gentillesse de nous accorder un entretien en vidéoconférence. C'est beau, la technologie.
Ou alors, lui aussi, il est mort, mais tu le sais pas. Et du coup, l'image que tu vois, en fait, c'est son fantôme qui essaye de te posséder.
I've always really liked H.P. Lovecraft. I read my first Lovecraft story when I was 8 years old. And what happened is that I was playing Chaosium's game, RuneQuest, which is one of the many heroic fantasy games that had come out in the late 70s. I think it was released in 78. And my friends are playing it, and I had a friend who knew the president of Chaosium, Greg Stafford. He got me to phone him. And I told him I had ideas for it, and I published a small book of monsters, and I put Lovecraft monsters into it for RuneQuest. Then I called Greg and I said, I proposed I'd like to do a expansion for RuneQuest based on Lovecraft's Dreamlands area, because the Dreamlands were heroic fantasy. I didn't have the idea of myself in doing a horror game for them this time.
Eh oui, révélation! La première idée de Sandy Petersen était d'adapter l'univers fantasy onirique de Lovecraft pour RuneQuest, pas de créer un jeu d'horreur et d'enquête basé sur les écrits de l'auteur. Mais bon, parfois les astres sont propices.
However, I was doing a horror game that I called American Gothic that I developed with my own system, and Greg Stafford wrote back and said he didn't want to do Dreamlands for RuneQuest because he was doing a game for a modern era horror game. And that got me really interested, and I said, oh, well, is there any way I can help with this? I can edit it or do anything. And then they said, well, you've never missed a deadline, you know all about Lovecraft, so we're basically taking the game away from the guy we have working on it, and they gave it to me. So the idea to do a game based on Lovecraft sort of came from, I don't know, the ether, but my idea was that I would do it with RuneQuest, and their idea was that I would do it with its own game.
Le jeu qui allait devenir l'appel de Cthulhu... Allô?
Oui, salut, c'est Cthulhu. Pour l'appel de Cthulhu.
Ce jeu, donc, a finalement utilisé le système de RuneQuest, appelé le système basique.
Chaosium said, we want you to use the basic role-playing system for it, because we're trying to turn that into its own system. And I said, okay. And I thought basic roleplay was actually better than the system I'd come up with, so I adapted it for Call of Cthulhu, and there we are.
Ce que Sandy Petersen ne soupçonnait pas, c'est que le succès du jeu de rôle L'Appel de Cthulhu allait créer un regain d'intérêt pour l'œuvre de Lovecraft, alors tombée dans l'oubli. Michel, je sais que c'est toi.
Well, there was two things that were weird about it. One was that very few people at that time had heard of Lovecraft. He wasn't well known as an author. He's much more famous now. I think that's a combination. Partly it's Call of Cthulhu, and partly it's Stuart Gordon's movies, Reanimator and so forth, have kind of made Lovecraft more famous. Well, what happened is that the few players who did know about Lovecraft, were thrilled to see a game called Call of Cthulhu, and they rose up in all their hundreds to buy it. And then other people started playing it because they thought, oh, a horror game, that sounds fun.
Et 35 ans plus tard, l'appel de Cthulhu reste toujours aussi populaire, avec 7 éditions et des dizaines de suppléments. Le jeu est en passe de devenir un grand ancien.
I thought it was going to be this obscure little role-playing system that would go out and sell maybe 3,000 or 4,000 copies, and I'd be proud of myself for having done it, and then it would never be heard of again. It was too obscure. Lovecraft wasn't well known. It was a quirky subject, a horror game, and yet when other people started to it rapidly became the biggest seller of Chaosium. And in fact, for like the last 10 years, until Moon Design took over Chaosium, it was pretty much their only game that they were selling, you know, with all the expansions. It was a natural for supplements because like doing horror adventures isn't trivial. You can't just make a dungeon. So it was really good at selling expansions. And of course, once it succeeded, a lot of other companies came out with their own horror games, you know, and those are all pretty much gone now, except for in the 90s, Vampire the Masquerade came out with a kind of a different ethos, it's doing well. But, you know, Chill is gone, and Stalking the Night Fantastic is gone, and all these other horror games, you know, have vanished. Call of Cthulhu was the state, still is there. So yeah, I'm quite astounded by its success.
Et si l'on devait retenir une maxime de toute cette histoire, eh bien ce serait celle-ci. Finalement, le succès, c'est comme une bière.
C'est-à-dire ?
Eh bien, c'est-à-dire qu'on sait jamais quand ça va arriver. Putain, Michel, ça fait 10 fois!